We're here at Sydney Harbour. I often think of Arthur Phillip sailing into Sydney Harbour on Australia Day, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip. He thought that this would be a place here in Sydney Harbour, that this would be a place for a jail. That's why he was here. He had convicts. He'd been sent out from England. He was being asked to make sure that they could be rehabilitated. Australia wasn't bad at running jails. Not great, but not bad. Pretty soon after, in about 1801, there was a young soldier in the New South Wales Corps called John MacArthur. Got up to a bit of corruption, but hey, this is Sydney. He brought out the merino sheep. He thought this would be a great country for sheep. And he was right. It was Australia's first globally competitive industry. But after that, in the 1840s, people came out thinking that Australia would be a good place to find gold. That's why my forebears came out here. You could say they were gold diggers. And we had a huge influx of people that came out to found the mining industry here in Australia. Australia's second great globally competitive industry. And that led from gold to lead and silver and zinc at Broken Hill, and eventually all the way down to iron ore out of the Pilbara. But you know, as you look around Sydney Harbour today, Phillip wasn't right. It wasn't the ideal place for a jail, and John MacArthur wasn't right. It wasn't quite the ideal place for a sheep station, and even those miners weren't right about Sydney Harbour, because we know, don't we, that the greatest industry that has ever collected around Sydney Harbour is property development. And you look around at the wealth that is on the foreshore of Sydney Harbour, and it's something that must have been absolutely unimaginable in the days that have gone by. And property and construction today contributes more to the Australian GDP than the agricultural industry, than the mining industry. It actually builds Australia's economy almost as much as those two industries put together. And it too is a great globally competitive industry. Maybe it doesn't get talked about in the way that the merino sheep got talked about. Australia rode the merino sheep's back for 100 years, or the iron ore industry gets talked about. The iron ore industry, which has been carrying our exports over recent years, but it's important nonetheless. And of course, the other great thing that New South Wales is good for is ICAC inquiries, and that also involves the property industry here in New South Wales, which has been singled out for special treatment as a result. So for me, it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to see an industry which is thriving as much as it is, and I'd like to see it thrive more. But I do want to take you back in my opening comments, because I'm about to be interviewed by David Spears. They said to me, before David Spears interviews, you can have a little bit of a talk. You know, the last man gets his last speech before the execution, as it were. So I come in and I get to say a little bit. And I want to take you back 23 years. 23 years ago, the June national accounts came out. It was 1991, and they showed that we'd had 2 quarters of negative growth, the technical definition of a recession. Now, we've had some negative quarters since then. I caused one when I introduced the GST. Everybody went out and spent before the GST came in, and then after it they closed their wallets and we had a negative quarter. The Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008 caused another negative quarter, but we have not had two successive negative quarters, the technical definition of a recession, since 1993. Now that's a long time ago. You'd have to be 50 to have an adult memory of that. So there are a lot of people, hands up all those under 50, now some of you are cheating, a lot of people who couldn't remember Australia's last recession. We had a credit splurge, the government tried to stop it, interest rates went to 17%, the economy collapsed and unemployment went through 11%. And you know the worry is there are many people in the political class and the parliament that can't remember that either. They've never lived through a recession. And the story after that recession, after 1991, is Australia rebuilt itself. Unemployment had got to 11%. We realised we had to change our ways. We realised we had to get our budget under control. We started working towards eliminating deficits. Eventually, we balanced our budget. We realised we had to get a better tax system. We worked away at getting a GST in place. We realised that the world didn't owe us a living, that if Australia just floated off into Asia, nobody was going to come and save us. In the famous words of Lee Kuan Yew, Australia would become poor white trash in Asia if it didn't change its ways. And coming out of that recession of 1991, we rebuilt our economy and we rebuilt our country. And we had rising living standards per capita year after year after year after year. And you know, it even continued after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. Because luck changed for Australia somewhere in about 2005, the mid-2000s, as I like to say. Luck changed and everything moved in our direction when China began its re-emergence. I don't say emergence, because China was a global world power in the 14th century. China began its re-emergence. And our luck changed. And our terms of trade began increasing, and all of a sudden, people wanted our iron ore. When I was Treasurer, the iron ore price was US $30 a tonne. Today, people complain because it's gone down to 80. In 2011, it peaked at $130 a tonne. Australia's luck changed. A lot of people thought the big event in the global economy for Australia in 2008 was the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Wrong. The big event was the re-emergence of China. And we went on with rising living standards right through 2008, 9, 10, 11, after an initial readjustment. And Australia boomed in a way we've never seen before. But the luck's beginning to run out. And for the first time since the 1990s, per capita incomes have stabilised in Australia. They are no longer growing. Real wages are falling in Australia. Young people under 50 who have lived through a period of uninterrupted rising incomes are beginning to experience something that's different. Now, I'm not saying that we're in recession, far from it. But things are changing. And our consumers are anxious. They've stopped spending. The household savings ratio is 10%. People have closed the credit card and opened a bank account. During the period of the 1990s, people were spending 100% of what they earned because they had this feeling of rising living standards and rising wealth. They're not doing that anymore. They're feeling anxious. Real wages are falling. Disposable incomes have peaked. And there's this feeling in our community now of people who have never really experienced these conditions of uncertainty and anxiousness. Now, I would have said to you as we came out of the recession of 1990, I would have said to you that there was a general consensus amongst economic thinkers in Australia about what we should do and where we should go. And I would describe the consensus in these terms. If we want to make Australia more prosperous, what we have to do is we have to make our economy more open. That is, lower trade barriers and increase trade with other countries. If we want to make Australia a better and stronger economy, we need to make our workplace more flexible. What we also need to do is we need to make our deficits smaller. And in due time, we got into arguments about making our surpluses bigger. That we had to make our taxes lower and we had to make competition fiercer. That would have been almost the consensus economic view of the 1990s and the 2000s. Our economy more open, our workplace more flexible, our deficits smaller, our taxes lower, and our competition fiercer. I have to say to you, I don't think we have that consensus anymore in Australia. For the first time in 25 years, income tax rates are rising in this country. And we're now having a debate about how to make taxes higher on superannuation, higher on GST. Our workplaces are becoming less flexible. And we're having big arguments about whether we should do anything at all about it or whether we should leave it as it currently is. Our deficits may be getting smaller, but that's being argued in the Senate just as we speak now. How small they will be. And it's a long way before we get into an argument about how big our surpluses should be. And our competition fiercer, well, there are some people that say we should be changing the Trade Practices Act to make competition less, not greater. That consensus, I think, is beginning to break down. Paul Kelly, in his recent book, calls it the end of the reform era, the book called Triumph and Demise. And so as we now go into big debates about where Australia should go, we're about to have a tax white paper. What are the principles that are going to guide it? I would have said to you one time, the purpose of a tax white paper is to figure out how we can cut tax in this country. But is that the purpose? Or is the purpose to figure out how we can get more revenue? Very, very important that we get these principles clear before we start down the road, believe me. Because if you don't know where you're going, you generally end up in a bad place. That's what happened to Wayne Swan, God bless him, when he had a tax inquiry. We ended up with the RSPT, the Resource Super Profits Tax. RSPT, RESPECT, Wayne. Find out what it means to taxpayers. The RSPT, which became the mining tax, which has now been abolished, which raised $2 out of every 100 that it was forecast to raise. You're in property. Imagine if you wheeled up to your board and said, I had an IRR of, well, in your case, 20%, but I raised $2 out of every 100 that I forecast on that investment. You would be adding to Australia's unemployment queue as we speak. That's where the last bout of tax reform went into Australia. And so we have an anxious consumer who's saving money, whose real wages is falling in a country where incomes have peaked, who is distrustful of the political class, where a consensus is breaking down. That's the problem. And we've got to figure out how to put that back together.